Hello, Top Tuggers, and welcome back to the Grab Bag. I am Gabriel Sinclair, and this is part two with the wonderful writer, excellent essayist, and a profound provider of excellent advice in many ways, ARX-HAN. Now, I know what you're thinking. Gabe, isn't this a little too soon to release a part two? I mean, each grab bag is clearly crafted to take months of digestion, so that each piece is its own proper piece of prosperity upon itself. And you would be right in that regard, especially since so few of you are of tough Tugger quality to actually not complain about the esoteric audio part one. But I've decided, by decided I mean Mr. Took himself, not even forget Mr. Thiel, Mr. Took himself has profounded on the concept of releasing grab bags a little sooner than necessary, sadly. So sadly, or not so sadly, will put a eugenic pressure on y'all to digest the grab bags quicker, to encourage the metabolism of your brains. So yeah, so this is a part two of our excellent interview I had with ARX-HAN. All right, ladies and gentlemen, boys and tuggers, I am Gabe St. Clair. This is Gabe's Grab Bag, and today I have managed to successfully drag back to the grab bag one luxurious ARX-HAN. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing excellent, sir. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. You see, I had to drag him back. I managed to blackmail him because what few people know is actually the reason why he's so secretive, but where he is right now is because he's actually a mercenary for the King of Myanmar right now. As a true, proper Asian reactionary, he's fighting the liberal Western dogs in Myanmar right now.
I can neither confirm nor deny these reports.
And the monarchy lives on. The last true great Asian monarchy is in Myanmar. We have to protect it. All right. So today is Saturday, and you just actually released a new piece today, comparing crypto and publishing and how you actually review the idea of NFT or NFT publishing as a method of kind of organically trying to make a middle market for literature again, as a kind of an artificial little middle market, if I understand that correctly, right?
Yeah. This piece that I put out, uh, I've been thinking about it for a number of years. Really, uh, what got my attention in this space was when Zero HP Lovecraft sold $50,000 of literary NFTs, I think in a day, if memory serves me correctly, on canonic.xyz, which is a sort of crypto publishing platform. And at the time, I thought this was first of all, it was a very impressive commercial, accomplishment for any writer, of course. Even accounting for the speculative mania at the time in NFTs more generally. But the optimistic side of me was hoping that this would portend a general trend whereby a mid-list author, somebody maybe who sells, say, a couple thousand books, uh, with every release every couple of years, if a small core of their fan base was, had gets into a point where purchasing literary NFTs is a sort of normalized collectible hobby, might that provide a lifeline and reinvigorate writers who are sort of in the middle of the road, as opposed to, these power law style blockbusters like J.K. Rowling or what have you, right? And I sort of observed the space over time, and there were a number of different platforms in the literary NFT space that I was following. Companies like Readle, which I think has shut down, Bookcoin, which I think never completely launched, Type, which was on Solana, Alexandria Labs, which I think was on ETH, and Canonic, I think, is sort of the last one standing, because essentially it looks like all of them really never got off the ground as far as I could tell in terms of actually moving units. The reason I'm still sort of cautiously optimistic about Canonic as a platform specifically is because they're still publishing books actively. But more broadly, just being able to collect payment on crypto rails is itself inherently useful, even if you are not releasing scarce literary NFTs, even if you're just a regular publisher who collects payment via crypto as opposed to Stripe or PayPal. The reason that's useful is because third-party payment providers are, of course, increasingly sort of arm's length extensions of the national security state slash the global American empire. Right? They are corporations that the state effectively subcontracts political censorship to as a sort of kind of plausibly deniable entity. Just as an example, we've seen PayPal, do this to a fairly egregious degree, and there's a very sort of incestuous network of highly questionable sort of national security adjacent NGOs who sort of work hand in glove to kind of consent manufacture weaponizing payment platforms into political entities. Now, I'm not a historian, on this matter by any means. I do believe this started around the time of Operation Choke Point, when they went after sort of sex workers and pornographers, and they sort of started expanding it out from there, if memory serves me correctly. But I do think if this literary space does grow, if this alternative literary space does grow, I would imagine there will be some sort of centralized response function vis-a-vis censorship. And as I posited in the past, I wonder if large centralized platforms like Amazon or Apple Books will turn to more sophisticated large language models to filter out and censor books that are deemed, fiction books in particular, that are deemed, verboten for, whatever reason. So yeah, it's an interesting sort of thing. I'm going to reach out to these fellows at Canonic and try and get my book on their platform, even just as a matter of principle, because I want to support this type of publishing project. But anybody who puts something out on Amazon, as incredibly useful as Amazon is, they're also very, very vulnerable to a giant corporation that has maximum leverage and power over their ability to reach an audience, which, no matter what your political stripe is, I don't think that's a good scenario.
Well, see, that's a fascinating point because it oddly, in a lot of ways, this dovetails with our last conversation with the security state. And I believe you're 100% right in regards that the economic is the extension of the formal state, the state as in a political state, a sovereign state. And I think the problem with a lot of crypto, especially something like this, what canonic is, I think what a few people in the crypto sphere are realizing is that crypto has to start thinking like a state, like a sovereign state, much like how the people of Venice, for example, if you want to create an independent trading empire, you have to realize that trade isn't free. That trade, there's this libertarian thing of trade about a state, but any sovereign body, any mass collective issue, a problem, collective action problem will eventually solidify into a state. It has to. Yarvin talks about this when he talks about Bitcoin. Is that fundamentally, Bitcoin? The reason why Bitcoin isn't adopted widely is to a certain degree is that it's not formalized. It's too dispersed. It's too widely available. It's like this in the tech trees of Hearts of Iron 4 or certain video games. Like Bitcoin is what if the 1930s and the New Deal and fiat currency never happened? Because Bitcoin is a renunciation of how the entire economic system operates today, ever since the 1990s, the neoliberal order. It might as well be an alien from outer space in terms of Bitcoin, because we have a currency where we have a economic object, which is Bitcoin, and we have this deeply strange and oddly, Nick Landian object known as the blockchain, and we are in a reality where this thing basically from an alternate reality, the concept of cryptocurrency, the concept of the blockchain, isn't deeply at odds with how our entire system works. So I think, for example, for stuff like Canonic, the reason why Canonic is good friends with Lomez and Passage Press right now is that I think in a lot of ways the cryptocurrency group and environment is realizing that they have to act and solidify as a political body in order to really fight or even not get hammered by regulations in the state.
Yeah, well, you see the way this. I mean, I pretty much agree with all of that. I think I mean, I'm certainly not a very deep thinker on these matters in the sense that I can't say that I have any real knowledge of modern monetary theory or this or that. But I think I think it's undeniable that crypto is a very important development, even as much as its primary use case appears to be gambling, but its secondary use case really is being able to store your wealth entirely out of a state-oriented system that is like highly resistant to seizure, right? Because you just need to know your seed phrase, and that's a very non-trivial use case. Particularly as the world becomes more multipolar and the reaction function of the global American empire becomes increasingly repressive at home, as we've seen recently in a very visible way. So, you see the state going after software developers in the crypto space who build anonymity facilitating software like Tornado Cash and stuff, which theoretically, shouldn't be possible because code is considered speech, right? So these guys built a sort of mixer that would allow you to anonymize transactions, and the state said that this was a form of them directly doing money laundering, except it actually wasn't, right? And so I think there's a lot of there are a lot of interesting ways this could go. I certainly agree it really is a kind of Landian technology, and that you can certainly imagine a scenario where a lot of the financial infrastructure moves to crypto and does become more meaningfully decentralized. But insofar as this presents a escape valve for capital in the United States outside of USD hegemony, the American government will move to crush it and or co-opt it, and it's sort of doing both at the same time right now. So I wish I knew more about this. I think it's incredibly interesting just because payment itself is a requirement for free speech rights, or at least for the free reach of speech, right? If you can't monetize your literary content effectively, that places a sort of capital constraint on your ability, in my view, to make a living as a writer, and particularly as an artist. So, uh, really, in many ways, the ultimate gatekeeper um, is these centralized publishing platforms, which have enormous power over us. And I think they haven't exercised it over, somewhat spicy, avant-garde literary authors yet. Possibly because of, I don't know, First Amendment reasons or something to that effect. I'm not sure. I think the only thing that's protecting us right now really is obscurity and the price of human content moderation if they were to start censoring books. I think it's probably just a business decision for them right now, where, if they were to take a more intensive approach to moderating on KDP publishing, for example, it would drive up their labor costs, which Amazon doesn't want to do under any circumstances. So anyhow, it's an enormously interesting and evolving situation, and I hope to be one of these sort of futuristic publishing pirates, out on an island, literally and or figuratively, doing my own thing.
Yeah, Bronze Age publishing, right?
Yeah, well, so just to pull on that thread a bit more, there's a venture capitalist who is a figure of some degree of controversy, not as much as Yarvin, but although he is notably Yarvin adjacent and Thiel adjacent, I believe he was a former VC at Andreessen Horowitz, which is one of the largest firms. His name is Balaji Srinivasan. He famously predicted the COVID pandemic earlier than almost anybody on Twitter. And he has this model of something called the network state.
Yes, I was thinking that was the same guy. Yes, I love that book. That was a great book.
Yeah, I've been meaning to read it. I think the critiques of it are also very, very interesting, in that I think the ultimate critique of it is really, if you start to do something like this in any meaningful capacity, the United States government will try and kill you, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So I think that really is the counter argument. And I think there are many interesting, I think it's a very interesting idea. It's a very interesting book, and there are many good and valid critiques of it. And for me, these things are salient because I can imagine a scenario where a combination of corporate censorship and regressive lawmaking vis-a-vis the First Amendment does meaningfully constrict our freedom of speech here in the U.S. and more, and abroad as well. And we think of say Western Europe as some bastion of liberal values. But if you actually look, I mean, I don't need to tell you this, but I think most people would be shocked about how intensely restrictive speech laws are in places like Germany and Britain, and it really is incredibly alarming. I would say, and so it's very hard for me to, uh, you know, take this idea of the defense of democracy particularly seriously when the police in the UK are kicking down doors for tweets and things of that sort. Like I mean, frankly, it's sort of ridiculous. Now, that is not to say that the United Kingdom is equally as repressive as more conventionally authoritarian country. But I view these things on a gradation as opposed to a binary, right? And I think the trends are rather clear in that respect.
Right, and especially in regards to into censorship, at least in a formal authoritarian states, it's very abundantly clear. If you are influential and you say something disrespectful to the power holder, there will be consequences. It's just like stepping in front of the bus, you're going to get hit by the bus. But with the decentralized authoritarianship of like the oligarchical England or Britain, they have this extreme sense of virtue, this extreme sense of freedom and emancipation. And you're right, it is deeply strange to see people getting their doors knocked down in Britain and seeing these men in yellow vests over tweets. It's actually quite bizarre. I mean, in America, it's even more decentralized. It's more you're just going to be unpersonal on Twitter. Your name is going to be leaked out, and if you aren't a very successful publisher of dissident literature, you will find an email from your work saying you are no longer working there. It's still functionally the same as the authoritarianship, but many more steps and much more torturous in a Kafka sense, really.
Yeah, yeah, and certainly what I find very interesting about the Guardian piece on Lomez, which you obviously alluded to, is I really my sense is that the reporter was tremendously frustrated that he couldn't just call up some corporation or company and say, "Hey, you have to fire this guy," right? Now look, that is not to say that I align with Lomez on various political topics, or I don't even really think he's primarily a sort of political figure uh, in terms of the fiction that he's posting. Certainly, you could argue that that is the case for the nonfiction, but the at the end of the day, if you don't have freedom of speech to say things that are offensive to other people, then the right doesn't exist, right? Like the whole point of it is that you have to be able to say things that are incredibly offensive to other people, whether fiction or nonfiction. And so, in that sense, I suppose I am a sort of a cringe classical liberal. You know what I mean?
Right.
And but at the same time, I can sort of see how the Overton window, or the idea of the golden age of the Overton window under classical liberalism, is sort of exaggerated for us. Like perhaps we look upon this with like rose tinted glasses, in the sense that um, you know was it an optical illusion because the ideological distance between left and right was much narrower than it is now, right? And so was it did we ever really have freedom of speech, or did we have, say, uh, two populations that were more highly overlapped in terms of ideological values than they are now, right? And so was that just a sort of brief window in historical time, and the sort of uh, base trend is always in the direction of, say, some dominant group gaining power and then imposing their norms, and recompressing the Overton window. Now, I myself, I sort of have this idea that the Overton window and the aesthetic Overton window, by extension, are always sort of compressing and expanding over seasons of historical time. Something somewhat analogous to sort of like a sine wave, right? It's going up, it's going down, it's going up, it's going down. Not quite a sort of Kali Yuga type model, but a sort of expansion and contraction type model. But, you know, at the end of the day, I think insofar as there is more chaos in the literary publishing sphere, and there are more upstarts, and there's more diversity of thought, I think in the end that will be a net positive for the quality of sort of cultural works that are produced. And there are trade-offs, you know, that are made when you architect a sort of mimetic landscape, if you will, or a container of a system that produces things like literary fiction or films, etc., etc.
Well, see, well, that's the idea of the overlapping. My view of it in the past, the reason why, for me, the Overton window felt like an ocean previously in the 90s and 80s, but in reality, it was a pond, and we were just kept very, very small inside that pond. It's only after you get hooked outside the water and you realize there's such thing as an ocean, and you realize that pond is much way smaller than the potentiality of the ocean surrounding that pond. I think that's what's happening here. And you're right in the idea of, Amazon is right now a very ambivalent landlord. We pay his rent, he lets us stay, but he doesn't particularly care for us one way or the other. If he hears one complaint from the HOA, he'll be more than gladly to kick us out. I mean, look what he did to Dugan's work over in Amazon, for example. And you know, uh, from my understanding, all the Ukrainian books and authors who celebrate his daughter's death aren't, being kicked off of Amazon right now, but his works are.
Right,
And
right.
I think the realities of this is that, Camille Paglia, she has this interesting idea in sexual persona. I just finished doing another pod with Adam De Renspek on sexual persona and Camille Paglia.
Nice.
And there's this one section yeah, no, she's fantastic. She's definitely of that. When you talk about this freedom of art and this patrician idea of freedom, she is that one of those figures of pure decadence that is the best exemplar, the most positive exemplar of those kind of glory decadent days. She was sharp as a whip, and she has this very idea of the view on the Egyptian arts and old arts, is that art was finally born from the authoritarian state, from fascism. We look at 1,000 years of the Egyptian state. All the arts were clerical, and they're subservient to the pharaoh. It is actually a crystallized example of art as a hymn, or art as a hymn to power, right? And in the modern day art, people say art is the expression of me, or it's the expression of society, or it's expression of history, but you're still subliminally, it is a hymn to a concept that's higher than you, or even if it's to you, quote unquote, it's just some weird platonic or fetishized version of yourself. Which oddly enough, I kind of compare to also to the Bitcoin thing. The reason why Bitcoin is a threat to the state isn't that Bitcoin serves no state. Bitcoin serves an informal state, a potentiality of another form of system. Each time you use a cryptocurrency, you are kind of, through economics, sending a prayer to a potentiality of being that's completely alien to another world. With Bitcoin, you're almost paying a hymn to an alternate reality where the fiat currency never existed, where we actually evolved from the gold standard to a new standard, but the concept of the standard still exists. And to compare it to the literature, I think oddly enough, there's actually a lot of connective tissue between your takes on crypto and the I forget his name, but the author of Where Did the Rude Boys Go? The man who wrote that excellent Mars piece on you and on Adam and the Mars Review of Books, which was a fantastic piece. Do you know his name? I forget his name.
Sorry, I was just unmuting there. Yeah, it's Ross Barkin, and yeah, I mean, I'm biased, obviously. He said good things about my book, but look, I think obviously it was a great book, a great article, and Ross has also written a couple of sort of thematic follow-up pieces to this. You'll have the yes. So the one that also has gotten a ton of traction on Substack is From Misogyny to No Man's Land: The Vanishing Male in Contemporary Literature. So this is a sort of broader overview piece. So yeah, I think Ross is certainly, one of my favorite essayists on Substack right now, and I think this sort of plugs in to this idea of androgenic literature. That I think we talked about that last time, but I think there's just such a profound discomfort with the depiction of the psychological reality of maleness in kind of highbrow literary fiction, right? Like I think there's just a really sort of intense aversion to that, and I think a lot of different writers are, I think maybe feeling a little bit more comfortable, sort of observing this pattern, and saying, look, this is sort of like an obvious structural bias in literary publishing right now, and what can we do about it? And has the pendulum overcorrected too far away from these sort of realistic depictions of male psychology, warts and all, right?
Well, see, that's exactly right. And you shared that piece, his second piece on the masculinity question. I thought it was fantastic, right? Because in that piece, both men are expunged from society, and men have retreated from society, and kind of willingly so. We willingly kind of just crawled underground, if you will, and we just kind of we have accepted that in a lot of ways. I have accepted that in a lot of ways. My generation has accepted that in a lot of ways. We are children of the internet. Internet is a deeply, oddly enough, insular society. When you read about the internet in the 90s and connect the world and all these utopian visions, they view it a very extroverted way. But how I grew up with the internet, and how a lot of my generation grew up, the internet is a deeply insular place with pockets. There's like a archipelago of different islands, if you will. All of them deep, but extremely narrow and extremely kind of insular. And when he talks about masculinity in both those pieces, I realized in a lot of ways, the reason why men have been expunged is because the sexual market and the relations between the sexes have become so unsteady and so unstable. Basically, certain aspects of the feminine have been inflated, and men have been deflated in a lot of ways. And I think it's a reality that the establishment can't really. It's creepy to them. It brings to mind the land peace mission creep. When you see something creepy, you can feel it. It's something you can barely perceive, and you don't want to perceive no longer. That is what creepy is. It's not defined, so you look away. And so that's what they're doing with male publishing. It's looking away. And you go from the Plato's cave of reality, and you see these little potentialities. Like a good example, as a beautiful introduction to Incel, when I read Mixtape Hyperborea, if you're a male growing up in the modern paradigm of literature, and you're reading about the modern day masculinity, and you have to treat it very seriously. Oh, our relationship to women, we have to change the way we treat women. Ever since post Gamergate and all these post art, men have to reflect on our relations to women. And then you read something like Mixtape Hyperborea, and it takes place in this weird realm called 2007, and it's about these bunch of guys, who make racial slurs at each other, who crack jokes, who are extremely horny and sexualize women, but they're filled with this juvenile life. These concepts are completely foreign to his ears. They're just kind of a celebration of what's around them in this moment in time. And you kind of realize when you peek out of the Overton window, when you kind of look out of Plato's cave, if you will, you see all of these bubbles. And I think that's what we are. I think that's what your novel is, Incel. It is a bubble of an alternate way of being. Because Incel is an extremely strange work of masculinity of this time, and in a lot of ways, this worlds of 2012 and then in Incel is just as alien to me, despite the fact having strong memories of it. The temporal aspect of it is just as alien to me, who's familiar in Incel culture, who is familiar with online culture, as it is to some of the normies who have reviewed your book. This idea of kind of enchantment, this idea of we're revealing how it really is. And the problem with the misogyny aspect and the problem of masculinity, where there's one begin, one end, one has to come to the conclusion that this concept of misogyny may have had a 20% useful description, but 80% of it was basically kind of just an oligarchic catch-all term to very limit the expressions of masculinity, and therefore it was even more stringent post Me Too, if you catch my drift.
That's an interesting. So sorry, can you just explicate that a little bit? Like there's a lot to be said about Me Too, of course, but what were you sort of gesturing at?
Well, what I was gesturing as, sorry, because I'm actually visualizing this in my head, is that the problem of the sexist is obvious. So from their perspective, this realization that the of male expression of reality is misogynistic in that sense. In their current conceptualization, the neoliberal woman who can have it all. In reality, that idea is quickly coming down. This, boss bitch, Hunger Games, Hillary Clinton, the pantsuit, this early 2010s reality of women having it all. They're quickly realizing you can't have it all. It is much the same way the post-Soviets era of the 1990s. It's much different than the exuberant, healthy, and celebratory aspects of the Soviet Union in the 1940s and 1960s. I think they're trying their best to maintain some kind of hegemony in this. And because I noticed in your piece about his piece, and I believe also Chris Lee's piece about masculinity, is that men can't portray their masculinity properly without delving into this concept, this definition of quote unquote misogyny. And in some ways, this distinction between healthy expression and quote unquote unhealthy expression is vast majority of the time a false or artificial distinction, to be honest.
That's a lot of food for thought there. That's interesting. When you say a distinction cannot be made or is an artificial distinction, could you give an example of that? I'd be interested in understanding that a bit more.
Well, for example, I've heard critiques of certain, basically even if of mixtape, this idea of sexualization of women. For example, treating women as sex slaves, obviously, or something overtly like that. Obviously, I mean, misogyny is a deeply complex thing. It's a personal thing. Yet again, it's something that there's an unhealthy way to relate to the womanhood. There is an unhealthy way of how the male paternity can constrict the feminine. But in a lot of ways, this was deemed misogyny. In a lot of ways, I mean, when you look at the political, let's talk about incels. Their aggression towards women is more towards they're actually fairness oriented. Their mentality is much more this isn't fair, right? In reality, than this concept or this idea of wanting to quote unquote oppress women or dominate women. And I see this idea all the time. And in reality, I think in a lot of those times when we use this term misogyny, when the hegemon uses the term misogyny, I think the reason why 80% of the time it is considered quote unquote artificial in my eyes is that you're trying to limit this natural tug and pull, because there is a tug and pull between a love and hate. There's an internal war of the sexes, and to limit the natural expression of this tug and pull, to try to artificially damn it, I think men can come to their own terms to women. You can't organically come to your own terms with the reality of who you are as a sex and your relation to the opposite sex. And I think that's why I call it an artificial distinction, because in a lot of ways, you have to let both genders in their own terms come to grips with the opposite gender. That's what I meant by that.
That's a very interesting and nuanced way of looking at things. If I understand you correctly, I think maybe what you're saying is that, or you know what, I'm just going to kind of riff on what you're saying, because I think what you're saying is really interesting, but there's all these different layers to it. But I want to pull on one thread. When I think probably most people who are leaning into these sort of very kind of realistic and unsparing depictions of male psychological interiority in literary fiction. I think most of these people, most of these writers, I think the consensus is that, what is categorized as misogyny has undergone a sort of cultural concept creep over time, to the extent that, the threshold for triggering that categorization just feels like it's been dropping too much over time, sort of thing, right? To a point where it starts to capture otherwise banal or anodyne daily interactions and experiences, right? And the way that I sort of mentally model, misogyny is not so much any one given mindset or any one given rule being broken in some fashion, like a social norm being broken. I think my intuition is more that it's a sort of almost like a spiritual orientation towards how you view, the other gender, right?
Right.
And so I certainly have kind of my own bias in the way that I think about this, obviously, in that, for me, I think uh, what I think actually happens is that I think the social alienation and the anger towards women comes first, and then what happens after that is the theoretical explanation for that gets retconned or grafted onto a pre-existing emotional core, right? So I want to be sort of a little more careful in the language that I use to describe this, and I'll sort of explain why. I think one of the places where I maybe initially missed the mark to a degree was using overly securitized language to describe the what was essentially a spiritual and emotional journey that many sort of, I think, young incels kind of have to go through, and using securitized language and sort of placing that in the context of a feeder pathway for terrorism, right? Because I think if we zoom out and we take a very, wide view of, whatever the statistics are, I think if we're being objective about how many people have been killed by can be at least credibly categorized as incel attacks or what have you, relative to the population of incels, this is obviously a very, very statistically rare phenomenon, right? And it's not really analogous to something like Islamic terrorism, in its heyday, say in the early 2000s or what have you, right? Because of the nature of there not really being any sort of formalized, consistent ideology, the incredible degree of heterogeneity among sort of groups of men who are unable to secure intimacy, and the lack of any sort of group coordination mechanisms that you would see in a sort of real broader political project, like say uh, Salafist Islam or something like that, right? So again, when I look at what misogyny is in this context, for me, I think it starts with social atomization and the pain from loneliness, and you get a sort of self-reinforcing negative feedback loop where you have somebody say who's atomized, who's isolated. They probably make some attempt to connect with others. They're rebuffed. They have a strong rejection experience, and then it reinforces this desire not to try again, sort of thing. And so it's kind of this like isolation spiral. And what follows that then is the desire for a salve or the desire to be soothed. And I think that really is where the kind of mimetic superstructure descends upon them, or they go seek it out. Because I remember the precursors to the modern black pill in the form of, the red pill, as it were. And I think what was particularly damaging about, the quote unquote red pill as a set of ideas was its ability to sort of persuade these kind of very young alienated men that effectively meaningful attached love is a scientific impossibility. So really what these guys basically did was they read a bunch of pop sci emo psych books without understanding statistical methodology or study design or the limitations of these different studies. And they kind of wildly over extrapolated into this like very hardcore biological determinist style framework, but even deeper than that, a kind of neuroscientific reductionist framework that said, oh, loving attachment is completely fake. It's this kind of mechanical neurochemical process, and that, of course, was one of the core through lines, in my novel. And just as a sidebar, there's one fellow who has very, I think, tightly and systematically deconstructed a lot of the kind of original red pill arguments, which later were further extrapolated into the modern black pill. His name,
Alexander?
yeah, Date Psych. And so I've skimmed his blog, and I think what he's doing is quite good. It is really quite superb in that I think one of the reasons nobody takes these, I mean, obviously the original Red Pill guys are very cringe now, but I think part of the reason they're not regarded as seriously maybe as they were, say, 10 years ago is because of guys like Alexander who are saying, look, if you actually look at the study, it's not actually saying you can't arrive at anything like the conclusion that, some of these guys are claiming that you can arrive at. And I think that's a very positive thing. Yeah, sorry, that's a bit of a circuitous answer to your
No,
question there.
that's great. This is like jazz. That was a wonderful articulation of what I was trying to stumble over, right? And you touched on a key note. The reason why I got so, I guess, dare I say, triggered of this is because when you're going through this, the reason these terms solidify into kind of political tokens. Let's say if you were to use a doctor's definition, kind of like the word retarded, right? All words trickle down to their debased form. When the word term a woman hatred, let's say he's feeling the blues, blue ball, he's feeling woman hatred right now because the first love of his life got heartbroken. He's a young man, he got his heart broken. This is he should not wallow on it, and so forth, so forth. That's a healthy way to get him out of that pit of saying all women are whores or extrapolating or be vengeful with it. But it is that corporate centralization of the concept, right? That is the main issue, right? And oddly enough, this also happened to the red pill movement, right? Because of a lot of the structural academic inertia of the blank slate. It was a kind of evolutionary pressure on the ideas of sexual realism or HBD and all these aspects. And so when you had the initial front of these blogs, they start off as blogs. You have something like Chateau Hartiche, you had the game, you had all these issues, and David M. Buss, obviously the godfather of this particular, the red pill, quote unquote, aka sexual relations. And the thing is, the red pill, it didn't start off as a sexual term. It was just a term adopted by, let's say, Moldbug in 2007, 2008 to describe, waking up from the hegemony of the neoliberal regime of the post World War II FDR regime. But since sex denotes it's a topic that everyone connects to, it quickly, like fashion, it goes from the avant-garde, it becomes ghettoized. When you think of the red pill now, you don't think of esoteric blogs discussing David M. Buss or Chateau Hartiche like it was in the early 2010s. You think of, Sneeko and Andrew Tate. These discussions have been completely and utterly debased. Much like, let's say, the marketplace of idea concept of misogyny was how the men struggle relationship with women. It became a token of power. It got corrupted by power. So now when we hear the term misogyny, we hear basically a potential enemy or potential friend in the Carl Schmitt political sense. So that's why I have a much more organic view of this. And I have a much more organic view of your novel. And I think this is actually a beautiful discussion to kind of jazz-like go into your novel. Because it started off with a primitive emotion, I believe, based on your own description of your novel. Incel was birthed from your grief of losing a close friend. And I was just curious, these feelings that made you want to write this novel, this wanting to write this book, were you always artistically inclined, or was it this kind of moment of this dark epiphany that caused you to want to become an artist?
It's such a strange path that I took. So I'll be somewhat careful in the degree of detail that I go into here, just for pragmatic reasons,
Of
obviously.
course.
But what I can tell you is that I didn't. I think I finished multiple drafts of this novel before it even occurred to me that I was an artist, right? And I'll give you a bit of context. I was uber normie. Very sort of just kind of like a boring guy. I think, frankly. And there's nothing wrong with being a sort of boring guy or anything like that. But when I look back on how conventional my life was until my early 20s, uh, just in terms of my modes of thinking and the kind of cultural automatisms that I had downloaded and enacted in an utterly thoughtless way for many years, um, I sort of look back with shock, and I don't understand how I could have ever been that person just because of how different I feel now. And the the loss of my friend was a sudden and violent transition into, I think, a more kind of painful reality. Now, I don't want to use the term red pilling here because I, I think it's sort of lost meaning. Like, certainly, I wouldn't say that my friend's suicide, quote unquote, red pilled me. I think I think that'd be just like a really gauche way of framing things.
Yeah, a bit too internet poisoned with that.
Yeah. I think a better way of saying it is that it it shattered a sort of automatic and thoughtless orientation that I had to the world. And it radically upended many of my pre-existing philosophical and metaphysical and personal beliefs. And after he died, it took quite some time before I started working on the novel. I think it was maybe 2 years or so. And actually, what I originally did was I just started writing some essays as a way to process my grief. They were not works of fiction at all. And I enjoyed writing some of them, and this is a bit of a millennial moment. I remember I published them on Facebook. I don't even remember what they were. Maybe they were called Facebook notes. I don't even remember at this point. And some of my friends liked these notes that I had written. They were just sort of essays about philosophy and related metaphysics and whatnot. And from there, it sort of just very gradually dawned on me that I wanted to write a novel. So it wasn't like, there's this famous story Murakami says where he's at a baseball game and he's like 29 years old, and he says to himself, I'm going to write a novel, sort of thing. So like it just occurs to him out of the blue. For me, it wasn't an epiphany. It was a very slow rolling, cumulative desire that grew. And then one day I just started working on it. And it took me quite some time to connect causally the very sad and very tragic suicide of my friend to the onset of this sort of second phase, of my life, right? And I still don't. I'm not really sure I fully understand what happened there. I think perhaps to some extent it was a moment that taught me about my own mortality, and in so doing activated a sort of creative impulse to perhaps maybe even partly overcome that, or to do something that I could look back on at least at the end of my life and feel good about, and feel that it was meaningful. But if I were to zoom out, I have to say that it's still hard to say a lot with precision about how that led me on that path, because I am not particularly convinced that introspection as it is a super valid or effective way of understanding mental causation. And if anything, it's probably the opposite, right? When you introspect about why you did a certain thing or went a certain way, it's, your brain retconning a chain of narrative causation onto some brain-based events that really were not caused by whatever you think they were caused by. Right.
Oddly enough, it coils into a narrative of its own rather than an actual recording or documentation of the quote unquote physical events that actually perspired.
I completely agree. Right. So I think a story, maybe a story is just your brain's way of organizing itself. And you're too young to remember this, but you used to have to defrag your hard drive, right? So, maybe it's something like that. But I mean, would I have ended up on the same? The counterfactuals in life are always fascinating, right? It's like, would I have, spent, roughly 10 or so years intermittently, working on this novel, if my friend, hadn't taken his own life in a way that completely blindsided everyone around him. I don't know. I'll never know. I do have a deep intuition that it did bring me on that path. Just because I look back and I can't even begin to understand where that motivation would have come from if it wasn't connected to that. Because everything that happened in my life after that felt like, I was going on one path and then suddenly an incredible force radically reoriented me on another set of, on another path. And, uh, you know, suicide is obviously a terrible tragedy. And, I think there's no shortage of it right now in the United States because, even if you view opioid overdoses, uh, with a bit of a zoomed in lens, you'll see really many of these are people killing themselves slowly and sort of indirectly, right? So I do believe we are in a kind of late USSR social style collapse, even if perhaps some economic metrics are still very strong for at least some segments of the population.
Right, but for group action, the social aspect of it is definitely very much similar to the USSR, and I believe in a lot of ways. And your description of your process, for me, it mirrors quite well to Anon because there's no distinctive, Freudian answer of why Anon is the way he is. We can't even. I think it was a brilliant move that you said it in 2012 because there is a certain aspect of nostalgia to it, but also in a sense, there's an aspect of it being a horror film in a sense. There's a retrochronic aspect of, I had such a good time reading this novel. It was very pleasurable for me. It wasn't disturbing at all, really. I loved Anon. He was a brother, in a lot of ways. It's very similar to reading something like Notes from Underground or Dostoevsky, dare I say, literally me Gosling-esque character. And, but there's these fragments of reality that creep in. It's like walking through a meadow and you kind of step on glass. When Anna talks to that girl, I believe in a gas station, and there's a background of the magazine with China, this very Yellow Peril-esque magazine that depicts the coming war of the economic wars of the trade wars with Trump and so forth, or that wonderful scene where he's talking to Rachel, his sister, and you realize, he's talking about how she used to make jokes and ethnic jokes and so forth, and you realize that she is drifting radically away from him in terms of politics. She's much more different than the girl she was that he knew. And from him, he's just a normal stagnant guy. He's still kind of that quote unquote apolitical white guy in the early 2010s to early 2010s, 2000s to early 2010s, that kind of complacent, very kind of, I guess you can say, containment. What we from the distant right, the era of beautiful, soft containment, where we were allowed, quote unquote, to be apolitical or non-political. And you see this kind of moments of our modern life, our reality creeping into this fictionalized past of 2012. It's like watching a horror film. Like, I was taught classically that you can only reread a novel twice to truly understand it. And from the perspective of Anon, you know, he goes through this journey, and you realize this journey is only will get worse because 4 years from now, his sister is going to be completely different. Anon is going to be completely different. Their relationship is completely shattered thus far anyway. But 4 years from now, when that certain individual comes down the escalator, it's going to be a complete shit show. And where we can see these elements of our present sticking out of the grass of this kind of, for me, a very pleasurable look into this kind of 2012-esque aura in time. So another aspect is, why did you decide to set it into 2012s? And how did you go about sprinkling these kind of hints to the horror that is our modern political reality?
Yeah, well, first of all, like I said earlier, I'm so glad you enjoyed it because this character was a hell of a lot of fun to write, the the divergences in the emotional experience of reading this novel among different groups of people is incredibly interesting to me because it it's a obviously it's simultaneously a tragedy and a comedy, right?
Absolutely.
Right, and as life is, I think, to quote the Joker, right? uh, but uh, so I would say the reason that I said it in 2012 was a couple of things. Firstly, you know, editing it was such a slow and labor intensive not labor intensive, I'd say craft intensive, right? It was a rewriting and writing this was a craft intensive process that was very, very slow and took a fair number of, quote unquote man hours. And the problem with setting a book in the present, if you're a slow writer, and I think I may not be a slow writer per se, but I'm definitely a slow editor because I'm a OCD level perfectionist, which is a strength and a fault, I suppose. But when the sort of development time for a work of literary fiction is that long, and when you're putting it on the shelf for 6 months or a year sometimes, then coming back to it, you know, it's I think it's difficult to constantly change all the chronological details and to remap it onto the present. And the reason for that is you can't just change external, shallow, and superficial signifiers of what era it is, right? Because the era that the characters are in informs the way that they relate to one another,
Right.
right? Firstly, just for practical reasons, I had to freeze it at a certain moment in time. And when I read somebody like Bret Easton Ellis, I think one of the things I actually love about American Psycho is the way he lists all the brands. And I think there's quite a nice nostalgic effect to it because it feels so situated and it feels so uh, material and rooted to a particular physical space that from that era. And I don't think literary fiction gets dated in the way that cinema does so quickly. There's something particular about the speed of evolution of cinematic media that is much more accelerated than the speed of evolution of language itself, for whatever reason, right?
Right.
If you compare films to books. So the reason 2012 though is such an interesting moment in my view is 2012 is sort of, you're right, it's right before the orange man goes down the escalator, right? It's sort of this kind of it's this moment where it still feels like we're at peak American unipolarity, we're at peak sort of peak power, we're still invincible. The social problems haven't gotten too bad yet. The fallout from '08 hasn't gotten too bad yet. and we're seeing the precursor sort of ideological superstructures start to sort of precipitate in the soup of the culture, right? We're starting to see the precursors to what become like the sort of like 80 IQ Andrew Tate version of the red pill versus the equally incorrect but at least comparatively more sophisticated V 1.0 version of the red pill in say 2010 or whatever, right?
Right, the autistic blogger, which Anon represents, that era of the red pill.
Exactly. And look, I mean, Hartiste had millions of followers, at his peak. Like millions of people read that blog, and I think there's no doubt that he was a culturally significant, blogger. And funny enough, like I think the character of Anon was a little bit sort of derived from him in that, as you're probably aware, Hartiste took he took a sort of hard right turn into sort of white identitarianism toward the end of his blogging career, and then I think he shut everything down probably because he didn't want to lose his job or something like that. But everything was in the culture at that point in time, but things just hadn't really precipitated into kind of open warfare that we saw from the Trump era onwards. And for me, that kind of sense of a kind of calm before the storm, remained intriguing as time went on. And I'll give you another example. When I started working on this book, incel-based terrorism wasn't a quote-unquote thing. It wasn't even a term, right? I started working on this book before the idea of the incel entered the modern lexicon, with Elliot Rodgers' mass killing event, right? And what was very interesting to me, or what's been very interesting to see, is, and I'm going to be writing a short Substack post about this, is sort of the securitization of the young alienated man, right? And the state's orientation to the young alienated man. And that's been a very sort of interesting thing to see. And of course, there are, all sorts of different reasons for that. But I think my broad intuition essentially is that the deep power structures, of the state are sensing their fragility as the kind of empire starts to fray, right? And when a political order is weakened, that typically is when measures of repression increase as the deep power structures tries to reassert control. And I saw recently, for example, there was some post about, I think like the FBI was monitoring gaming discords for potential terrorists or something to that effect, right? So, it's like, Islamist terrorism, I think, was not militarily defeated per se, although you could kind of argue that with ISIS, I guess. I actually think Islamist terrorism was culturally defeated by wokeism. Like that's the hypothesis. That's my hypothesis behind, why Asian American literature is boring, as we've spoken about before. But I think basically what happened was all these alienated young Muslim men were integrated into progressive coalitions and American culture more broadly, and they just lost interest in Islamic terrorism or the caliphate or these ideas, right?
It just became janissaries of basically the left, basically.
That's right. And or I mean, I think I would say my view is that there's different layers to it. There's more nuance to it than that. I mean, what's interesting to me about the mass slaughter in Gaza is that it is splitting both left coalitions and right coalitions in the United States. Like it's sort of like a very unique historical event in my view, right? Because there are pro-Zionist and anti-Zionist camps both in the right and the left. But it's the first thing that really seems like it might create a large fissure in, you know, the broad progressive political coalition, right? Because the dissonance between a kind of ethno supremacist massacre where you drop like the equivalent of 3 Hiroshima bombs onto like this tiny strip of land or whatever. The dissonance between that and you, like progressive values is just like too great, right? Like it's just too obvious of a gap, right? So it's creating a crisis there. But I actually forgot where I was going with all this. I'm a runaway freight train at this point, so I'll stop there.
No, it's all good. It's great. And of course, Mr. Peter Thiel, he obviously meant the completely justified self-act by the Israeli government. Please don't stop sending us your Thiel bucks. But no, that's brilliant. And I think, oddly enough, this brings me an example that you used actually during that Reddit battle Anon has, when he brings up the World War I soldier. The idea of the relation to securitization of the male. I mean, one day in Europe in 1914, the 1914 equivalent of Anon had this deep journey, this deep, magnificent personal journey of growth and relation with the woman, female sex, and so forth. And he comes home and his dad's reading a newspaper that Archduke Franz Ferdinand has been shot, and his complete reality has been shattered. And I think that was actually what made me horrified more, disturbed me more, was these shattered pieces of our political era in society's past. Because you're right on the securitization state. A reality, this is when the young male was he was isolated. He was already been excommunicated from, let's say, the tribe of the modern culture. At least 2010 was basically the early era. The raunchy comedies of 2000s stopped. It was when men kind of went their own way, if you will. That was when the term was even coined. I think was like 2014. I remember men going on their way. Probably that was when I was aware of 2014. And but now it's much more worse when you realize the securitization of the male. Now we're basically being watched from a distance. You can feel the eyes on you. Basically, as a young male in American culture, you can actually feel it now, which is worse, I'd say, than just completely just being isolated from the jump. People are discussing you, the concept of you. You become a concept, right? You become a politicalized entity, and you either celebrate it or accept it, or you just kind of desperately try to dig even deeper underground and wish you were more isolated, like back in the old days, like a lot of the current incel websites do. And one aspect of the book itself, I wanted to kind of ask you to get back, so I don't get ripped of my Thiel funding, is his relationship with his sister Rachel, which pops up this weird relationship he has with her. We get sparse elements of their backstory together. The biggest character arc. I half jokingly said that she's the lawful neutral villain or lawful evil villain of this piece. Because she appears from Anon's point of view, because we know Anon isn't hallucinatory. We know Anon, for the most part, is relaying things as he sees it. So it's hard to... The clearest look we have into her character is that beautiful little excerpt Anon gives to the psychologist near the end, where Rachel as a kid pulled legs off a spider just to see what it would do. And obviously it died. She did it out of a sense of coldless curiosity, which I found kind of interesting as a reversion, because it reminded me, instinctively reminded me of an earlier scene where Anon actually, he crushes the bird, the baby bird that fell. But oddly enough, that he crushed the baby bird not out of curiosity like Rachel did with the spider. He did it out of a true sense of empathy, because he describes, that poor baby bird literally being torn apart by ants. And oddly enough, it is an inversion of this. Rachel as a child does it just for the sake of kind of power, while Anon does it out of a sense of deep relational empathy, particularly for animals, because he also has a deep empathetic moment with a chimp later on. So I kind of wanted to ask you, what was the dialectic maybe between drafts or compared to the finalized story? What was the relationship between Anon and Rachel near the end? How would you conceive the relationship?
Yeah, I think that to me is sort of perhaps in some ways the more contradictory, multi-layered, ambivalent relationship than the one he has with Jason, right? I think the push pull with a figure like Jason is he's he's an aspirational figure in terms of being sort of hyper masculine, but there's this equal and there's this equal level of psychological displacement that comes from this kind of compensatory sort of need to level himself psychologically with him, right? And so I thought that dynamic was a lot of fun to work with. The dynamic with his sister to me was, I think, uh, this for me was really, I think, less about having her be a sort of carrier of any kind of particular world view per se, but more, I think, just to represent the manner in which a otherwise sort of psychologically sort of normal person can completely fail to understand someone who is close to them, right? And my intention was not to present her as a kind of caricatured villain or anything like that. And what's so funny is when you write a book, your subconscious leaks out into the text in many different ways. And it honestly never occurred to me that these were opposites. His merciful killing of the bird and her sort of torturing to death of this insect, right? But obviously, it's such an incredible, it's such a simple and obvious opposition, right? It's such a simple and obvious metaphor. And to me, that's sort of gestures toward just the magic of the process of writing literary fiction, which is that when you shape and structure and sculpt a manuscript iteratively over a long period of time, your brain forms this kind of very deep and multi-layered representation of the text and the characters that is mostly, I think, even in your subconscious. And then, these ideas come to you in the evening, and I have to write ideas down in a book next to, where a little notepad next to where I sleep, because I just have all these, fucking ideas like coming at me all the time, right? And with her, it was really important for me not to present her as a sort of 2010s kind of gawker feminist caricature, right? Because I think that would have been the very easy move, which was to sort of, and like the reason I want to write literary fiction is I want to write a lot of the motivation is because I like to write interesting characters who notably divert from the kind of culture war archetypes that we almost use as a default lens for interpreting human interactions. And what I love about literary fiction is the prose. Prose is so information dense that you can pack really complex representations of human beings into into this kind of long form narrative, right? And for me, complexity means contradiction, basically, right? And so she, I think, doesn't represent a political class or like a BuzzFeed writer or this or that. To me, she just represents someone who cares about her brother, but she has a deep assumptive framework and to a certain degree a lack of empathy for how unwell he is and really just how much pain that he's in. And you can, I think part of that lack of empathy comes from her own, I think, reiteration of certain kind of cultural scripts that were sort of de rigueur at the time. This was before, if you, I mean, damn, I mean, you must have been like 13, so you must have been really online that you know all these figures. I'm kind of impressed, but
First time has been called, impressed. When my mother thinks about that time, the word that comes is not impressed. Go on.
Right. So, the the idea with her was that as smart and as caring as she was as a sibling, she just didn't have the ability to have this mental model of really what it's like to be a non, right? Like this idea of this kind of like there's just something missing at the core of her conceptual understanding of how alone he is and how he feels. And the friction comes when she sort of uh, reiterates what were the tropes at the time, like just be yourself, just be normal, sort of thing. There's a little bit of a kind of effective altruist slash rationalist flavor to what she's saying. That was just to add a bit of kind of historical strokes to that era of time, sort of thing. But the alienation that comes between them is not due to a lack of concern from one sibling to another. It's simply due to, I think, them inhabiting very divergent bubbles, to use the analogy that sort of Jason makes earlier on when he copies and pastes an email post from somebody who is sort of like a thinly veiled caricature of Slate Star Codex, or who is now Astral Codex 10, if nobody knows, the guy who got doxxed by the New York Times for no reason.
Right.
So, to me, I didn't want her to be a villain. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't a caricature. She was his sister. She cared for him. And there was a really deep failure of communication between them that created this schism, along with his own tendency to lash out. So, I mean, I would he's arguably still sort of responsible for that schism, but you can sort of understand from his the interiority of experience, why he got to a point where he became that frustrated and made a comment that was rude enough to sort of blow up their sibling relationship.
Right, and I think that was actually beautifully done, because when I first read it, I thought, when he throws that letter, that very properly written letter to his sister, into the water on his birthday, I thought that was. I didn't know if that was intentionally. I thought it was left more ambiguous, or it was like, oh, I wonder, because it goes. They have that argument in the park, and then there he is in therapy with Mr. Green, and I realized from your point of view, the bubble theory of relationships. When I first reviewed the book, remember, I had a different version. I had the silent version, if I remember correctly, where Anon does not speak to the neighborhood woman. So that was so the biggest example, the metaphor theory I had was the bubble relation that Jason had. Just by being in her aura near the end. I think oddly enough, her relation of seeing Anon in that target. I think if I recall correctly, yes, him being a creep in the target. That was basically her inversed, her negative version of Anon seeing his neighbor's wife smoking on the footsteps, and that raw grief. When she was exposed to him as a raw sexual entity, as a man, dare I say, the ghost of Darwin basically creeped up on her, and she was terrified, because you're right, she has no frame of reference to who Anon is. We have an entire 200 plus page book of interiority to associate as Anon, to see his cultural custom, to see him as honestly as an avatar, an acolyte of these belief systems, which he honestly acts out almost as a paganistic belief, or as like a avatar, to be honest with you. For her, as a normie woman, as from 2012 perspective, to see your little brother kind of being something so yet alien, yet so uncomfortable in a deeply unconscious level, something, I use this term a lot as I read, on the nerve. Is the concept of sex, it's hardwired into us. So I could actually, I've developed in subsequent readings of this novel, I've developed a much more nuanced idea of, because he even describes the sexuality as terrifying, the idea of convergent evolution. For him, it's, he's been smoking this cocaine, basically, I'm mixing my drug metaphors, for a long time. But for her, it was just deep explosion right in her face, basically. And she just did not find it, Anon's too autistic, and she just has no frame of reference for this world that he's in. So that caused a fracture. and this bubble theory of bubble theory of humanity, of everyone has their own POV, everyone has their own HUD, and in this bubble is like, our cultural assumptions, our own particular Bayesian priors that developed over time, and these overlapping of bubbles can either strengthen both of them or cause them to pop. In the case of Anon, yet again, much like the bird, I know this is mostly unintentional, like the bird and a spider, when Anon overlapped with the grieving woman near the end, it I don't want to say it strengthened him, but it did change him. While the overlapping of his raw bubble with his sisters, basically in their sense, they both bubbles kind of popped. At least from using that metaphor you used.
Yeah, and just to build on this idea of the bubble, I actually got the idea from a Slave Star Codex blog piece. I can't remember the title of it, but it was this very well written articulation of essentially the same thesis, which I then sort of rewrote in kind of like my own literary style, which is a bit of a sort of lighthearted and albeit loving parody of the way that he writes. And so, he had this experience where he noticed that all of his patients seemed to relate to him in a certain way and to have a certain personality. And then conversely, he has some other colleague who I believe is also a psychiatrist, and that guy was just complaining that everybody would break down crying in his session and cry throughout the whole session. But Slate Star Codex's patients never cry, and they're sort of just like him, and they nod along to what he's saying and put together practical plans for dealing with different things. And to me, that was a very powerful blog post because I think it was just a rubric for understanding social alienation as being fundamentally driven by the sort of kind of necessarily limited spheres of human interiority, right? Because if we're to sort of model, like, what is empathy, right? What is empathy? Really, empathy is your ability to mentally model what is it like to be somebody else. So, there's this famous paper by Thomas Nagel, quote, "What is it like to be a bat?" Right? And so where he argues, bats are conscious, right? Well, human beings are social animals. We often ask ourselves, what is it like to be, a woman? What is it like to be a man? What is it like to be the president? What is it like to be disabled? What is it like to be homeless, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And I think that when I look at the way that this relationship fractures, it's because it's exactly as you say, it's this kind of mutual sort of, bubble implosion where neither side can reach to the other, right? And canonically, the ending for me in the way that I wrote it, and I know that I changed it 2 times after I published it, and so the third one is the canonical one. But for me, it's an uplifting ending because really what happens is he comes to understand something very, very simple. And what he comes to understand is simply that, yes, women suffer too, right? Like women suffer too. And it's really that simple. And I think once you get to a place where you can understand that, it becomes much harder to be a ideologically rigid misogynist, right? And in the way that we might classically attribute to, say, more extreme instantiations of various online subcultures and whatnot. And I ultimately think that process of, of understanding uh, is not really captured in the politicized language of quote unquote de-radicalization. I think really it's a spiritual healing. I think it's a spiritual understanding, right? Which is simply the universality of suffering. So, uh, to a degree, it's a kind of allusion to, Buddhism or whatnot. There was one fellow who read the novel and DM'd me on a social media platform that I won't name because he was sensitive about privacy and not wanting to be doxxed. But so this person DM'd me and they said that it was a very difficult book for them to read, but at the same time they felt very moved by it, and they characterized the ending as this kind of neo-Buddhist epiphany, i.e., that rooted in the universality of suffering. And that, of course, is a theme that runs throughout the book because what, interestingly, Anon has more empathy for birds and even I think worms, as I recall, than he does often for attractive women, right?
True. It's actually very true.
Yeah, yeah. And then it's this constant theme that moves throughout it, right? That everything that is conscious suffers, and that is that is arguably a very sort of, I think, Buddhist notion. Not that I myself really know much about Buddhism at all whatsoever, but certainly the problem of suffering is central to any religious or metaphysical or spiritual framework, and is one that must be accounted for.
Well, on this topic of universal suffering, I think this actually naturally brings us to go in to finish up. I think it'll be a great way to finish this up. Is well, quickly. I wanted. Let's see, we can do a 2-for-1. Quickly, the view on the ending with the psychiatrist, Mr. Green, where initially I was very flippant of him. I thought he was very normy. I thought, I'm with Anon. Obviously the Green didn't even. It was the visceral, raw pathos with the woman near the end that got him this guttural feeling of true suffering, not this kind of very bourgeois, kind of very hippie relation between Jainism and the suffering of ants and so forth. And clearly the two didn't get along. But after reading listening to your interview with Leafbox, and you discussing the problem of suffering, the suffering to even to an anatomical level, to even to that of an atom, I realized upon reading large chunks of this for multiple times that Mr. Green's philosophy of looking at Jainism and looking at the universal suffering, the fact that suffering in itself is oddly enough universal across all life and all of existence. I realized to some degree, I thought Mr. Green, the psychologist, was almost a conduit for your beliefs. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind delving deeper into that psychological scene between him and the psychologist.
Yeah, so that scene was a hell of a lot of fun to write. It's one of my favorite scenes in the book, and the entertainment for me came from this sort of constant implicit power struggle between the two of them, and this sort of jockeying for positional advantage through nonverbal cues and other things. And I think to sort of answer your question with a generality, I would say that I think the number one mistake, or sorry, a very common mistake that a writer of literary fiction will make is that they will turn characters into mouthpieces for essays that they themselves would want to write. And that is a very, very simple and easy trap to fall into. And you can get away with it if your execution is really good or if the essay is really good. For me, I would say not only is the character of this therapist a sort of conduit for ideas that I have around the universality of suffering, I would say that every character is at once a conduit for ideas that I have held in my mind either loosely or strongly. And also at the same time, they are not that, i.e., they are their own agents, they are their own entities. There's no, one-to-one mapping of what's being said to what I, myself believe, very simply and plainly. And what I mean by this is that the characters, in the end, as the drafts evolve over time, they have to evolve into a life of their own, right? And I would say the only exception to this actually is, I think paradoxically sort of the this the kind of academic debates that come up one or two times, right? So there's a critique of the methodology of some of these evolutionary psychologies that comes up. I am leaking my own views in there, and the character of the person that he's arguing with on Reddit is a sort of parodic presentation of myself to a degree. So as you recall, there's this what is effectively simply not a moral critique of ethno-supremacist, identitarian, expansionary, militarized European states. It's not a moral critique. It's simply a kind of consequentialist critique of that mode of political organization. And it's not really serious. It's more of just like a parody of what that would look like. But at its root, I do ultimately fall on the side of, like states being organized around militarized ethno-supremacist grounds ultimately basically will lock in their own military overextension and cause destructive wars, sort of thing. Aside from those two exceptions, the remainder of the book is really, and every character is a dialogue between different agents, which are themselves kind of represented in my own brain. And I was very, very, very tightly cognizant of being careful not to be preaching in the form of a novel. I hope that I was successful in this regard, although I'm sure some people may have different views. And perhaps I've revealed too much on the process side, but I think that's okay because, only the people who have probably already read my novel will listen to something like this. So
only hardcore Haniacs will listen this far, basically.
I think you're going to say Hananiites, and then you realize that it doesn't work because I'm not an Hananiite.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out a clever way to divert from that. So I was like,
Yeah, and look, at the end of the day, I am willing to talk to anybody who comes at my work with seriousness and mutual respect, and it's a great joy and a great privilege for me to have these kinds of conversations. And you really did the work to prep for this, and I'm so impressed by that, and I'm also very grateful for it. And I have really, really enjoyed chatting with you.
Oh, this was fantastic. Thank you very much for this. And I on your point of agency, you're right. In a lot of ways, each character, even the first woman Anna has sex with, Chloe, in a lot of ways, she is also an agent of mercy. You're right. These aren't preachers. These aren't, ranters. These are each person. They have their own bubbles. Obviously, there are agents, but they're agents of a force that is beyond them that they aren't aware of. The only one who is mostly aware of his agency, Jason, to a certain degree, which I agree full-heartedly with your change from him being a Tyler Durden character to a character in his own right. I think going to Tyler Durden Fight Club route would have cheapened it to a certain degree. And I would really like to end this off with if you wouldn't mind, a reading of two quotes that kind of show the growth and changing, while also staying true to this odd character of Anon, who is, in my point of view, kind of a person who's writing Dante, writing his love for Beatrice, but that person isn't Charles Darwin. So if you wouldn't mind, I would like to read these two excerpts and close out with that, if you don't mind.
Please go ahead, sir.
All right. This is from, I got the digital version. I got the paperback here. So for a moment, she understands the world as it truly is, and she is overtaken by the pain of seeing. She weeps and stares into the mutating face of Darwin's God. Speaking in strange tongues, he tells her the flesh is a fungible commodity, that, under the eyes of desire, All sexual relation are fundamentally reducible to units of dopamine. Then he shows her the bodies that twist and roil in the open pit of the sexual marketplace, like a wet coagulant mass of writhing eels. Escape from this system of relation is an impossibility, for I, too, am disposable in this regard. The arms and legs of my body, a mere system of locomotion to support the primacy of the penis. I, too, am oppressed by the unyielding regime of phallocentric feudalism, a system that provides its penile peasants with no potential recourse in the open market of modern society. Even with its injection of super physiological doses of ZRP into the shaft of my flaccid meat stick, no growth occurs. The drug is useful for one thing only, for ingestion and intracranial absorption, for priming my head to explode upon contact. Thus, she and I are both victims of biology. And so there's that great scene of when Anon is
Yeah.
this was for me. This was one of my favorite. This is when he describes, I think, convergent evolution. Which, by the way, I want to say I hope you kept on the spine, the little crab on the physical edition. That was a great touch, by the way, on the book, by the way, on the book spine. Um,
Thank you, sir. Yeah, we're putting it back in. I have to update it, but yeah, I love that
Yeah, it was a wonderful
crowd.
touch. It was a great idea, and in this dialogue, this stuck with me so much because obviously the Landian, the Lovecraftian, of course, the idea of Anon as an oddly enough a deeply he of a worshiper of Darwin or this caricature of Charles Darwin, and then it changes from that into this. Well, he doesn't, you know. Hold on, I'm just getting to that page right here, 280. Five. So that section was when Anon describing the horror of quote unquote his reality. In the psychiatry section, he says, my only fault is that I see how things are, not as they ought to be. He's the perfect Machiavellian realist, and that's him when he's the most devout agent of this spiritualization of the concept of Darwin. While this here is a beautiful evolution of that same Darwinistic figure basically becoming Dante and singing hymns to his Beatrice. The curls of her flesh as she folds into your arms, fetal, the ridge of her spine pressing into your chest, and the warmth of her back timed with the rhythm of her breasts. The two of you laid flat on your sides, your leg woven into the gap between her knees, and her doing the same with yours, skin on skin, with your fingers interlocked and the quiet synchronicity of a unitary consciousness. Resist the nausea that surpasses you with description, Anon. This is what you want, remember? Here, nothing is capable of dissolving your happiness. Held within your arms, she's an organism that cannot be reduced to her component parts, not to organs, not to tissues, not even to atoms. In this way of being, your love exceeds your lust. It is not that you are attached only to her body, for there is no boundary between her physical form and her. As the atoms in her hands blend seamlessly into the atoms in her arms, they flow into a smooth gradient of particles made conscious and whole by the vigor of an unseen magic. You see now the truth of it. In your heart, you are a believer, and you always have been. Yes, somehow these arcane forces have converged on the anatomical vessel of your lover's body, binding the muscles and the skin and the bones, housing all the tiny little pieces of her brightness. Here, then, your language fails you. How else to describe it, then? What is the miracle of consciousness if not the soul? Incredibly, this divinity extends even to you, transmuting your putrid desire into something greater than the turgid selfishness of your erect penis. And with that, I think that is a brilliant send off of Anon from a dogmatic follower of Darwin to oddly taking that language, his scientific brain, and evolving from a purely mechanical being to a person with a soul, still articulated extremely mechanically, but you can clearly tell in that moment he has developed a true passion for life, and he articulated it in an extremely new and deeply raw way.
Thank you for that wonderful rendition. Those are absolutely some of my favorite passages from the book, and hearing them come to life is really great.
Yeah,
And for anybody who's listening to this and feeling a bit black-pilled, I certainly do not want to position myself as any kind of self-help figure. I am wholly unqualified in that regard, and that is not my intention with any of the work that I'm doing, because I view them fundamentally as artistic works that cannot really be instrumentalized. But at the end of the day, I do believe that there is real meaning to be had in this life, as sort of corny as that might well sound. And I understand that a lot of people are in terrible situations, and they are just really objectively difficult. And all I can say is just hold on and keep going. That's the only minimal advice that I have for anybody else. But that was a very moving rendition. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you. I hope the list added a little bit of personal flavor to it, and I think those two moments of time, those two sections, are some of the most strong. There's a lot of strong passages, but those moments of time of Anon, where he doesn't abandon his mechanical language, he doesn't even abandon his deeply Darwinistic worldview, but it transformed to something from his POV. From it is awkward where he develops these sincere, what he calls this love. He's describing love, but it's from his very unique lived in POV, and I thought that was a deeply unique way of articulating it. I think these two sections really show the strength of your writing and the strength of your empathy and the strength of your character. And I think overall this was a fantastic time, and I thank you so much for your time and bearing with my autism. And with that, in that note, I think we'll end it here. Everyone, good night and good tugging. ARX-HAN, any last words?
Yep. No, just thank you for the opportunity to chat and for being a fantastic interviewer. I'd encourage anybody who's interested in this type of writing to check out my book and to check out my Substack, www.decentralizedfiction.com.
All right, perfect. Everyone, good night and good tugging.